A quick disclaimer that this was for the most part a compilation of reviews I released about 2 years ago, so if you've seen any of those, this might be some repeated content for you. That being said, this video will contain 3 new reviews, 2 re-reviews of Disco Elysium and Balatro, games which I replayed last year, so I have new things to say on them, and 1 review that I left out of the original series of review videos, which was my Fear and Hunger review, which I recorded but decided not to release because I didn't think it fit the vibe of my channel at the time, but now I think I would rather include it and talk about one of my new favorite games. So if you hear some audio discrepancies, that's why. With that out of the way, enjoy the video. Also, spoiler warning probably for some of these. I don't really remember what I put in them, but probably spoilers.
The Legend of Heroes Trails of Cold Steel 4 has all the same strengths and weaknesses as Cold Steel 3, but cranked up to 11 in both directions, right down to luring you into a false sense of security with an Act 1 that stands as one of the better parts of the series in isolation, but is held back by the slow-moving train wreck that follows it. Starting with the good things Cold Steel 4 lists from Cold Steel 3, the character moments are on point. Anytime a character starts monologuing, you know you're in for something good. The stars of Cold Steel 4 are definitely Yuna, Crow, and Cedric. Yuna slots right into the protagonist role during Act 1 so smoothly that she manages to stop the group dynamic from slacking in Reen's absence. Her speech to the old Class 7 motivating them to go rescue Reen was one of the game's major highlights. I was actually surprised we got Crow back. I probably shouldn't have been, considering how the Cold Steel arc follows every other major trope of the genre, so logically Crow's redemption wouldn't be any different, but what can I say? He spent most of Cold Steel 2 and 3 being adversarial, so I just figured he was going to stay that way. I'm glad he did return to the party though, because the resolution of his conflict with Reen was a long time coming, but was all the more satisfying for it. As for Cedric, he's a character I probably should have singled out for praise in my Cold Steel 3 review, so allow me to remedy that here. Cedric has been one of the most interesting characters to watch develop over the course of the Cold Steel arc, because his progression from bystander to full-on antagonist is shown to the player essentially in full, making him very easy to sympathize with despite the side he chooses to take. Unfortunately, the characters were my 1 point of praise for Cold Steel 3, and so it is also my 1 point of praise for Cold Steel 4. Remember how I thought Cold Steel 3 was bloated both lore and cast-wise and how that brought down the game significantly in my regards? Yeah, it gets worse here. In Cold Steel 3 I was frustrated with the curse because it felt out of place with the pre-established lore. In retrospect, that was an objectively incorrect statement. Magic like that has been part of the series since the Crossbell arc. Cold Steel 4, however, provides me with a more valid reason to dislike it, namely in how it robs almost all of the antagonists of their agency, right down to the main antagonist of the arc and arguably the entire series up to this point, Chancellor Osborn. Turns out, he's actually a reincarnation of Emperor Dreykels, the mechanics of which is never explained, and is a loving family man. Personally, I thought Osborn was great as a pure evil, power-hungry villain, but this twist completely spits in the face of that by essentially saying that he can't be held accountable for his actions. Admittedly, they do say later that the curse only amplifies the malice that already exists within the people it affects, but it still makes them do things they would never do otherwise, so I'm calling your bluff, game. That was a bad writing decision. Then there's the matter of the narrative itself being way too bloated. It's never been a secret that the writers have at best a skeleton outline of the series' plot going forward, and that plot beats are inserted and changed as necessary, but by the end of the Cold Steel arc, the fact that these games are written one at a time becomes painfully obvious. I'm confident that if the writers planned the whole arc out in advance, the story could have been covered in 2 or 3 games instead of 4. So much time across the Cold Steel arc is spent either on field studies or doing glorified fetch quests to save kidnapped characters, both of which could have easily been cut down or axed entirely with a little more foresight. If you assume an average of 60 hours per game, that's 240 hours for the entire arc. There are definitely not 240 hours of necessary story content here, and if that's not bad enough, there's still more. A third of Reverie, at least as far as I'm aware, is devoted to wrapping up the Cold Steel arc. They've spent 4 full-length RPGs telling the story, and apparently it still isn't enough. Trails games can feel slow sometimes, but realizations like these are what really put the phrase Trails games are poorly paced into context. And of course, with a bloated plot comes a bloated cast. It's actually absurd getting full party shots in the middle of dungeons and seeing like 20 characters just standing there. It was during one of these full party shots when I was struck with the realization that Machias has not done anything since Cold Steel 1, but he's part of Class 7, so he has to be there. Then there are other characters like Duvalie. Duvalie, who has spent the last 3 games being absolutely insufferable, decides that she's had a change of heart in Cold Steel 4 and joins the party, only to be immediately backseated until the confrontation with Arian Road towards the end of the game. 30 plus playable characters sounds cool on paper, but the impracticality of it becomes obvious in execution. They didn't even have time to properly finish Reen's character arc. He's a self-sacrificing hero with low self-esteem to the bitter end. So that's it then. I've played through 4 Cold Steel games and spent the entire time complaining. Why do I like these games? That's not a facetious statement, I'm genuinely confused. I've said in the past that the series has a lot of potential, but out of the 9 games I've played so far, only 2 of them have really lived up to that potential. I come to these games to the writing, come out of each one saying it was poorly written, and then eagerly jump into the next one hoping that this time they'll finally get it right. Am I just a sucker for JRPG tropes? Or maybe I'm really just enamored with the idea of an overarching narrative. Maybe my real takeaway from the Cold Steel arc is that I'm allowed to like bad writing. I mean, I did enjoy the game. It never felt like a slog to get through or anything. It was just really easy to point and laugh at during some crucial moments, which is not something you really want from your grand fantasy epic. I might very well come back to these games in a couple of months and decide to knock all their ratings down a few pegs, but for now something in me is still enjoying them. Before I close, there were a couple smaller points I wanted to bring up. One, I've been doing most if not all of the side quests in each of these games since the Crossbell arc, and I have to say, Cold Steel 4 has one of the series' better batches. Especially during Act 3, a lot of them tie back into the lore or wrap up character subplots, which are always fun things to include in side content. 2, I have to say, the soundtracks of the series really fell off. The Sky arc and especially first chapter were littered with these bouncy jazz fusion tracks that were strong across the board. Then the Crossbell arc hit, and all of a sudden each game had like 1 or 2 memorable songs. Cold Steel 1 had at least a handful of songs to add to the playlist, but the rest were major letdowns. Third and finally, I made a comment in my Cold Steel 3 review about how I thought Cold Steel 4 was going to turn my opinion on Muse around, but unfortunately it didn't. They did give us the info dump they were teasing, but it wasn't anything particularly surprising, and her personality largely remained the same. She was just less mysterious. It's not a major point against the game, I just wanted to give the follow-up. I'm a little nervous going into Reverie. Of the Trails games currently available in the West, it's one of the 3 I see most consistently singled out for praise alongside Second Chapter and Azure. I've seen some fandom takes go as far as to say it ties up all of the loose ends from the Cold Steel arc to give it a more satisfying conclusion. I want to buy into the hype, but I also thought the aforementioned other 2 games were not among the series' best, so I don't know. I already have the game, so I'll probably jump right in just to see how this all ends, since I'm basically already there. I guess we'll have to wait and see. Starting off with the long-awaited finale to my Trails marathon, though some of the stank from the Cold Steel arc inevitably lingers on here, by and large, Trails into Reverie is a return to form for the Trails series. I don't see much point in comparing and contrasting the merits of the game's different routes, because they're intertwined throughout and ultimately all tell one cohesive story. Furthermore, despite the fact that 2 of the 3 main characters hail from Erebonia, it should be noted that Reverie is a Crossbell game through and through. It began development as a third Crossbell game, and the narrative is centered around Crossbell and its independence. This works out well, as historically the games in this series are at their world-building and storytelling best when they take place in Crossbell. Unlike the other 2 Crossbell games, Reverie isn't so concerned about Zemuria's politics, but that doesn't mean its world-building is lacking by any stretch of the imagination. Reverie instead ends up being the Trails game that most directly grapples with Zemuria's rapidly advancing tech industry, introducing a super-intelligent AI, Elysium, as its main antagonist. I usually don't care for these sorts of emotionally impartial concept antagonists, but it works here, as Elysium is a fascinating exploration of ideas that were planted in the background at the very beginning of the series, but haven't naturally arisen as a point of conflict until now. Reverie is also the first game in the series not to have any narrative padding. In fact, I'm almost compelled to say that the game had the opposite problem, and moved too fast at points. They really expected you to have read 3 and 9, giving only what was absolutely needed of Nadia and Swin's backstory to understand the plot. But after 9 whole games that, even at their best, tended to range from mildly to comedically bloated, I'm hesitant to complain about Reverie opting to pick up the pace a little bit. Take all of that in combination with a handful of well-conceived and well-executed plot twists I genuinely did not see C's reveal coming, and you've got a recipe for a narrative that kept me engaged for the entirety of the game's runtime. The character writing was on point here too. Throughout the Cold Steel arc, Falcom was clearly making a concerted effort to write stronger character dynamics, getting better and better with each game to the point that here in Reverie, every major character moment lands and serves to develop the characters they involve. All of Reverie's protagonists experience significant and satisfying character growth by the end of the game, including Reen, who finally got some resolution for his character arc after 4 games of practically nothing. I wouldn't go quite as far as to say that it made up for Cold Steel's baffling reluctance to develop its main protagonist over the course of its 4 full-length JRPGs, but it was appreciated nonetheless. Side note, the fact that Reverie started as a proper third Crossbell game implies that when they finished developing Cold Steel 4, they were content to just leave Reen's character arc as it was, which is absolutely insane to consider, but thankfully that didn't happen. I do have one noteworthy complaint about Reverie, which is that we have now reached unmanageable levels of cast bloat. Reverie brings back every major player from the Erebonia and Crossbell arcs, with a couple from Libero sprinkled in there for good measure. A feature that sounds cool on paper, but in execution fails both in terms of writing and gameplay. In terms of writing, only around half of the cast has a personal stake in the conflict, meaning that the other half of the cast is just kind of there. The writers at Falcom finally discovered the good sense not to have every character chime in at every major moment anymore, but this means that instead, the ones who don't have anything to say simply don't contribute anything. At that point, why have them there at all? I know this might seem like a bit of a hypocritical complaint, but really my point is that they should just have a smaller cast. A lot of the less important party members are fleshed out through the Daydreams, and those do a great job of giving additional closure to those characters, but those characters didn't need to be playable in the main campaign in order for the Daydreams to do that. Then in terms of gameplay, party composition is forcibly changed so often that it hardly feels worth adjusting members' kits when you know most of them will be swapped back out after an hour or two of gameplay. The thought of constantly maintaining every playable character's equipment is genuinely overwhelming, so I'm thankful that most of the game isn't actually built around having to do that. Overall though, the irrelevant cast members are by no means deal breakers, meaning that Reverie is the first Trails game I can recommend without any major reservations since really zero, save for the fact that you need to play all of the games that come before Reverie to really get much out of it. I had fairly high expectations going into Trails through Daybreak. Pardon me for being a bit dramatic, but I had come out of the Cold Steel arc questioning why I even liked the series to begin with. It's not that Cold Steel was a slog the entire way through, as the games themselves were fun to play, but the arc as a complete narrative managed to squander every single interesting idea that it had by taking forever to get to the point, and by choosing the path of least resistance over the option that would make for more nuanced character writing almost without fail. I stuck with it, however, as the game that closed the Cold Steel arc, Trails into Reverie, was hyped up by the fandom as sort of a light at the end of the tunnel. Though Reverie is not my personal favorite game in the series, it proved to me that Falcom hadn't completely lost their ability to write a decent narrative, and so upon completing it, I was back on board for the next game, Trails through Daybreak. Daybreak was the first Trails game I was part of the Western hype cycle for, having caught up with the series a couple months before Daybreak's release stateside, and much like Reverie, Daybreak is often cited as one of the best games in the series, so it was one of my most anticipated games for this year. Now that I've finished it, I get to write another long-ass review to determine whether or not I think it merits that praise, so let's get into it. A lot of the praise I see for Daybreak Online is on account of its protagonist, Van Arkwright, and I am happy to say that the praise is absolutely warranted in that department. Don't get me wrong, I love Lloyd, and I at least respect what they were trying to do with Ream, but Van has more personality than the two of them combined. Even if he is, as the game itself states on multiple occasions, a softie at heart, the street-hardened persona he puts on makes him the most entertaining Trails protagonist to watch since Estelle. For the first half of the game, he's more of a static character, imparting his wisdom onto his employees as they learn just how a Spriggan operates. Then, towards the back half of the game, the mask starts to slip and you get to see more of his weak side. In ways, I actually preferred when he was more of a static character, since his whole selfish selflessness problem retreads a little too much of Rean's character arc for my liking, but it is sweet seeing how the other party members start to take after him by the end of the game, and manage to bring him back to his senses by using his own philosophies against him. Van himself essentially being the final boss a la the scrapped original plan for Xenoblade Chronicles was a particularly cool beat. A couple of annoying side characters aside, the rest of the cast is strong too. Something else that Trails through Daybreak does especially well compared to other entries in the series is maintaining intrigue. Van, Agnes, Rosette, Quatre, and Burgard at some point in the story all get larger mysteries attached to them. A handful of these are resolved during Daybreak, but most of them are only teased at, left as plot points for future entries to follow up on. I've heard mixed things about Daybreak 2, but these incomplete character arcs alone already serve as strong launching off points, so if it's able to resolve them in a satisfying manner, that'll certainly earn it points with me. Also, while we're talking about the cast, I'd be remiss not to mention Judith, who doesn't have any major questions attached to her, but was impressive in how she went from a character I initially thought was annoying to one of my favorite members of the party despite never actually changing that much. She just got funnier with each appearance. Moving away from the writing for a moment, I ought to mention the combat in this review, as the orbment system has been completely redesigned in this game, marking the most dramatic difference in combat between arcs yet. In the Sky and Crossbell arcs, you couldn't set arts. You had to set stat-modifying quartz a certain way to get the arts you wanted. Then in the Cold Steel arc, arts were made their own separate quartz that were equipable alongside the stat-modifying ones you used to use to build arts. Now in the Calvert arc, the two are totally separate, with the stat-modifying quartz being set to your orbments and arts being attached to arts drivers. There are pros and cons to this approach. At first I wasn't a fan of this change, as the arts drivers having preset arts limits customization even more than the Cold Steel arc did by forcing you to have to divide your orbment between stat-modifying quartz and arts quartz. But as you progress, you'll unlock new arts drivers that have more slots to set arts of your choosing in. So in the end, I think it's a fair compromise for how much it streamlines the process of building a character. A completely new feature is also introduced to the combat itself in the form of S-boosts. S-boosts are chargeable consumables that provide mid-battle stat increases, but more pressingly than that, you now need them to use S-crafts. This means that marching into battle with a party's worth of fully charged S-crafts and wailing on the boss is no longer a valid strategy, as you need to charge up these S-boosts in combat first. Much like with the changes to the orbment system, this annoyed me initially, but then I realized it was just a skill issue and I needed to try harder. So you know what? Fair play game. Normally I'd include the section on the plot itself with my assessment of the cast to make for a larger section on the game's writing, but in discussing the plot, we must unfortunately discuss my one major complaint with the game, which is that of its disjointed structure. The first half of Trails through Daybreak takes a page out of Second Chapter's book, where the party goes on a wild goose chase around the country as the game's main antagonists, this time a mafia group called Armada, conduct various experiments using this entry's plot MacGuffin. What's especially damning is that the Geneses are functionally identical to the Gospels, in that they're basically miracle machines that can do whatever the plot demands of them. The only difference between the two is that the Geneses are man-made. I have to wonder why Falcom loves this episodic chapter structure so much. It forces the stakes to reset each chapter, making it harder to build up to a final conflict that feels appropriately dramatic for a JRPG. The only thing carrying over between the first 3 chapters being some lore and world-building bits about Almada and the country of Calvert itself. Then the second half of the game decides that it does want to have a central conflict after all, introducing and promptly following up on the threat of nuclear weapons in chapters 4 and 5. In a similar vein to Reverie, it highlights the dangers of Zemuria's rapidly expanding technology sector, and manages to be genuinely climactic despite only actually being a real point of contention for 2 of the game's 8 chapters, counting the prologue, intermission, and finale. I wish the whole game focused on this plotline, as it taps into the series' world-building strengths like the crossbow arc did so well. The game's finale also felt largely unnecessary, like it could have been lumped in at the end of Chapter 5 without too much trouble. Chapter 5 already felt like a natural point for the plot to stop, and most of the finale is spent running through Edith and doing repetitive mini-boss fights before having to refight all the villains you supposedly already took down in Chapter 5. The final confrontation with Dante's and the aforementioned fight against Van's inner demons, literally, are both incredibly strong points to end on, but I wish we didn't have to redo everything we already did in Chapter 5 to get there. Makes that whole conflict kind of feel for naught. I don't think Daybreak had a bad plot, far from it, but I do think it could have been a bit more focused, especially since they already had a good idea and executed it remarkably well. It was just placed in the middle of the game for some reason. As a final note, more so because I forgot to talk about it in any of my previous Trails reviews than anything else, I want to talk about the graphics. I played the Switch version of Daybreak after playing the Cold Steel arc on PS5, and it definitely took some getting used to. By Reverie, Falcom had really perfected the Trails art style in 3D, with not only great modeling but also some incredibly fluid animation during certain important cutscenes. I've seen clips of Daybreak running on PlayStation and it looks even better. Unfortunately, the Switch version lacks all the fancy lighting effects that makes Daybreak on PS5 pop, which is a bit of a letdown. I understand that some compromises had to be made to get it to run on Switch though. For what it's worth, the game does run pretty well. The frame rate does chug a bit during a handful of busy cutscenes, and sometimes S-crafts take a while to load, but other than that, the experience was pretty smooth, which I suppose should take priority over nice graphics. Alright, now we've got a little bit of a postscript note for you, because there were 2 other points I wanted to discuss in the original review, but forgot to include when I was actually writing it, and when I was looking over it again for this video, I couldn't find a nice spot to fit them in, so I'm just going to talk about them here at the end. First, I wanted to praise Ven and Elaine's dynamic. Basically, every time they're on screen, there's like a whole second conversation happening in the subtext of their interactions, and it feeds back into this thing with the intrigue I was talking about earlier, where you really just want to know more the entire game. We do get good amounts of it by the end, but I still would say that we don't know the whole story of it, so I'm definitely excited to see more of that in Daybreak 2. My other point was that I really enjoy how now that we're like pretty knee-deep into the series, Falcom is really using the whole world and all of the little details they've set up. We don't get into detail about all of the different factions during Chapter 5 because it's kind of assumed you know about most of them. And it's really rewarding for people who have been following the series for a long time because you get to be like, oh, there are 2 Dominion in this game, that's really cool. Or that's Sally's Mafia group. But at the same time, it doesn't alienate new players by really forcing you to go full glossary mode on everything and look up all these different characters on the wiki. I really appreciate that integration. I think it's a nice, cool little feature for fans who have been following the whole series. Note that I didn't complete Rise from the Ashes on this replay, but when you think about it, Rise from the Ashes is really the original DLC case, so I still feel comfortable declaring this playthrough as finished. What struck me most about the original Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney after replaying the Apollo Justice trilogy just a few months ago is how quaint it feels compared to the newer entries. The first 2 cases are exceedingly short, and Takumi is clearly still trying to figure out who these characters are as he's writing them. Since most of the Fae Clan lore isn't established until Justice for All, Maya contributes shockingly little to the proceedings. I know this is an in-universe plot point, but even during the investigation segments, her presence is barely felt, unlike in later entries where she has a very strong personality. And Phoenix is extremely green. Like, I thought he was acting uncharacteristically inexperienced during Spirit of Justice, but clearly I forgot the first game, where he stumbles through almost all of his arguments. Replaying the first game really solidifies my opinion that the original trilogy is just one game, since Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney doesn't do much besides introduce the trilogy's main players. It is ironic then, that by virtue of having to set up all of its main characters, Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney is the only game in the main series not to have any filler cases, with a typically filler case 3 being crucial here to Edward's character arc. None of these points are meant to be complaints, by the way, just observations that surprised me. Edwards may be the only character in the game with an actual arc, but that's okay because it's a thoroughly entertaining arc that does a great job tying all the main characters together, and culminates in what is still one of the best cases in the entire series. Plus, The Ace Attorney formula is still a winner here, even at its most basic, as proven by Case 2's managing to tell a complete story with 2 investigation segments in about 2 hours.
If I'm being completely honest with myself, when taken on its own, Trials and Tribulations isn't anything crazy. The overarching narrative between cases 1, 4, and 5 is novel at this point in the series, and I promise I'll get back to it later, but the decently lengthy cases 2 and 3 that make up the entire middle section of the game have little to do with said overarching narrative, in my opinion to the game's detriment. The Stolen Turnabout is often hyped up as one of the series' better filler cases, and I will admit that the return of Adrian Andrews from Farewell My Turnabout, as well as the twist of using a theft to cover up a murder, are both pretty cool, but even on replay I failed to find fan favorite Luke Atme, who most of the praise for this case is based upon, as more than mildly entertaining. Then there's Recipe for Turnabout, which I'm willing to say is an outright bad case. Much like the Stolen Turnabout, Recipe for Turnabout is largely notorious for having one notable witness, but unlike the Stolen Turnabout, Recipe for Turnabout's mystery is frustrating. Often I felt like witness testimony was being arbitrarily considered relevant and irrelevant based on whether or not it supported the line of thinking the game wanted you to follow, rather than consistently being either taken into account or discounted. Recipe for Turnabout was originally intended for inclusion in Justice for All, and I shudder to think how Justice for All, which I personally consider to be a really underrated entry in the series, might be considered today if it included both the case with the problematic love triangle and the case with the problematic LGBTQ+ representation. Why does Trials and Tribulations still get a perfect score then? Well, this brings us back to the overarching narrative I mentioned at the beginning, or more specifically, the final case in that narrative, Bridge to the Turnabout. Bridge to the Turnabout is not only an excellent case in its own right, but masterfully ties up every loose end from the original trilogy and wraps them up in a nice thematic bow. The Fake Clan lore established in Justice for All, the drama surrounding the Hawthorns established in this game, and to a lesser extent even Edgeworth's backstory from the original game are all brought together to make for what might just be one of the greatest finales in gaming. It is for this reason that I cannot bring myself to call Trials and Tribulations anything less than the best entry in the series, despite the fact that there are other games in the series that might have a greater number of quote-unquote good cases.
I've been thinking about Phoenix Wright as he appears in Apollo Justice Ace Attorney a lot lately. It's a fairly divisive interpretation of the character within the fandom, and I used to be on the side that thought that he could have worked if only he didn't revert back to his original self in Dual Destinies. But now replaying Apollo Justice Ace Attorney with its most recent re-release, I'm more of the opinion that this isn't a direction that works for this character at all. It makes perfect sense that Phoenix would become jaded after losing his badge and being forced to play poker for 7 years to make ends meet, but this version of Phoenix isn't just jaded, he's aloof, which is not a word I would use to describe Phoenix Wright at any point during the original trilogy. Seeing him casually leave his daughter to her own devices for extended periods of time, only popping in to spout something cryptic and generally uninterested sounding before leaving immediately after, is uncanny. It's not like Shu Takumi forgot how to write Phoenix either. In the flashback sequences during Turnabout Succession, he acts just like his old trilogy self. I bring all this up because I think in some way, my thoughts on this version of the character reflect my thoughts on Apollo Justice Ace Attorney as a whole. Much like Phoenix Wright in Apollo Justice Ace Attorney, Apollo Justice Ace Attorney as a game is confused about what it's supposed to be. Turnabout Succession is an excellent mystery when viewed in isolation, and Christoph Gavin is an excellent villain, but as many others have pointed out, the final case of the game intended to introduce this new up-and-coming defense attorney as a key player in the series going forward is hardly about Apollo at all. The only time Apollo Justice Ace Attorney isn't about Phoenix Wright is during the game's Nothing Burger filler cases, which are entertaining in the typical Ace Attorney fashion, but don't do much to develop Apollo and Cliver in the same way that Phoenix and Edgeworth developed during the filler cases of Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney. For a long while, I didn't really get the hype around Turnabout Trump, but now on my third time playing it, it finally clicked, and I got to see why so many think it's the best first case in the series, even if I personally think that 3-1 still tops it. I was excited to see what the rest of the game had in store, but Turnabout Succession is such a pivot from everything that happens in Turnabout Corner and Turnabout Serenade that I got kind of lost. Ultimately, I'm back where I started. I have a hard time viewing Apollo Justice Ace Attorney as anything but a setup for a sequel that never came. If we ever ended up getting follow-ups for the plot threads regarding Lamar and Kristoff, maybe I'd be singing a different tune. But as it stands, Apollo Justice Ace Attorney is simply less than the sum of its parts. When I first played Dual Destinies, I thought it was fine. That's equal parts praise and condemnation. On one hand, a good game is a good game, and Dual Destinies is undeniably a good game. On the other hand, Ace Attorney is a series that I tend to associate with a high bar of quality, and so when fine or good are the best words I have to describe it, it would be fair to say that in some regards the game missed the mark. Having replayed it now within the context of the Apollo Justice Trilogy re-release though, I think that Dual Destinies actually has a lot going for it. It just takes a few missteps along the way that holds it back from reaching its true potential. The best thing that Dual Destinies brings to the table is newcomer Athena Sykes. Despite the fact that she's only properly playable in one case, she's the narrative through line that links all of the game's cases together, and as such, Dual Destinies can more or less be considered her game. Would I have preferred it if the game was called Athena Sykes Ace Attorney and if Athena was the lead lawyer on every case? Yes, but even with things as they are, I would still argue that Athena gets more development than Apollo does in his own game. You can see how even in filler cases like Turnabout Academy, Athena has personal stakes that directly lead into her character growth, so I'm inclined to give the writers a pass on this one. Besides the fact that she's the core focus of the plot and has a decent character arc, Athena also brings with her my favorite lawyer gimmick in the series, the Mood Matrix, and personality-wise provides a nice contrast to Phoenix and Apollo with her spunky can-do attitude. That all being said, this brings me to my first major complaint with Dual Destinies, which is that I think the writers underutilized Athena and Simon's personal connection prior to the final case. Part of what makes the original Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney so compelling, in spite of the fact that it's nowhere near my favorite entry in the series, is in how Shu Takumi uses Phoenix and Edgeworth to develop each other over the course of the narrative. Even though the details of their connection aren't revealed until that game's climax, you can still feel it through their heated interactions. Not so in Dual Destinies. Athena and Simon appear to be almost perfect strangers until the end of the game. You could argue that this is because Athena doesn't take the lead on every case, but I don't think it would have been that hard for them to drop in more personal taunts here and there earlier on in the game. My other major complaint with Dual Destinies is that I think they should have shown Apollo's side of the investigation during Turnabout for Tomorrow. We don't get any major Apollo development until the end of the second game in the so-called Apollo Justice trilogy, and even then, we only get to see the resolution of his arc in this game. Opting to develop Apollo's suspicions in real time instead of having the setup happen off-screen would have done wonders for his character arc. It's the final case of the game, so it's not like having things be a little more elaborate would be out of place, and they wouldn't have had to get rid of Phoenix's section either. In fact, I think showing the contrasting perspectives would have only served to further demonstrate Apollo's inner turmoil. As it stands though, this replay of Dual Destinies has done little to shake my impression of Apollo as much more than a slightly grouchier, more cynical Phoenix Wright. There are a number of legitimate complaints you can make about Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney's Spirit of Justice. The fact that Phoenix, Apollo, and Athena, despite their cases worth of experience, are all written like this is their first time in a courtroom, so that cases feel less like unraveling a mystery and more like presenting some absurd hypothetical and then working backwards to prove that it was the case. The fact that the writers forgot to give Nayuta any redeemable character traits until the last hour of gameplay. The general absurdity of the DC Act and premise alone. These are all rather major detractors, and in a weaker game they might be deal breakers, but here they are at best mild irritants and distractors from the things that Spirit of Justice does well. Trials and Tribulations may still lay claim to the title of best overarching narrative in an Ace Attorney game, but Spirit of Justice undoubtedly has the best set of individual cases in the mainline Ace Attorney series. Cases 2 through 5 all have wonderfully layered plots that emphasize the series' mystery element in a way that no prior game does, and all choose at least one character from the game's main cast to highlight and flesh out in a manner usually reserved for final cases. Admittedly, the tutorial and DLC cases are pretty mediocre, but being the game's bookends, they don't really interrupt the flow of the game's narrative in any significant way, and so I'm willing to be more forgiving towards them. Spirit of Justice is also the first game in the main series since Trials and Tribulations to feel confident in its direction, both in terms of its themes and its characters. You may not like the direction it chooses to take, but I would much prefer any sort of confident direction to Apollo Justice Ace Attorney's identity crisis, or Dual Destinies' timid testing of the waters. Replaying the Apollo games as a trilogy, I've begun to get the distinct impression that nobody, not even Takumi, really knew what to do with Apollo. 3 games after Apollo's introduction, and finally Spirit of Justice is willing to give the man a proper character arc. I will say though, as much as I love Spirit of Justice, I do wonder where the series will go from here. Apollo has been effectively written out of the story without either of the 2 major plot threads from his debut title having received any form of resolution. I suppose they could bring him back for a single case just to wrap things up, but it would feel like a bit of an awkward move. Then there's the issue of having Phoenix remain as a playable character in the series going forward. Personally, I thought that Phoenix was actually used really well in both Dual Destinies and Spirit of Justice. His character arc more or less having been completed already, he acts in these games as an impartial observer who enhances the arcs of other characters not necessarily suited for playability, Athena in Turnabout for Tomorrow and Rafa respectively. This worked in those games, but with there no longer being 3 lawyers in the picture, I can't help but feel it would sharpen the focus if they just cut the number of playable characters all the way down to 1. The obvious solution is to make Athena the main character going forward, and this is what Turnabout Storyteller and the final scene of the game both seem to be pointing towards, but with Yamazaki now out of the picture, I wonder if whoever the next main series writer ends up being would care enough to continue the arc of a barely developed character in favor of just writing something involving the ever-popular Phoenix Wright. I'm really rooting for Athena Sykes' Ace Attorney, as the dynamic between Athena and Simon in Turnabout Storyteller has a completely different energy to anything in the series so far that I think would make a fresh new start, but I suppose we'll have to wait and see.
Ever since the original trilogy remaster that released back in 2019, I've been slowly chipping away at the Ace Attorney series. With Investigations 2 finally being localized into English back in September, I've finally gotten to complete every single Ace Attorney game. Though Prosecutor's Gambit is not my personal favorite game in the series, I can certainly see why it holds that title for so many others, as from a technical standpoint it's the most well-constructed game in the series. To my recollection, Prosecutor's Gambit is the only canon entry where every case directly progresses the plot. Even the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles has those 2 B-plot cases featuring Natsume Soseki. Actually,
I find it sort of surprising that after mastering the overarching narrative here in his spin-off series, Yamazaki decided to go the usual episodic route when handed the reins to the main series, as the most praised entries in the series, Trials and Tribulations, the Great Ace Attorney games, and Prosecutor's Gambit, the very game we're discussing now, all feature a strong overarching narrative element. But I digress. Additionally, Prosecutor's Gambit serves as an excellent epilogue to the original trilogy. Not only through the numerous witness cameos, I particularly enjoyed Penny Nichols' cameo wherein Edgeworth forgets who she is, and her text box name tag reads assistant instead of her actual name, but through its exploration of Edgeworth's character post-Phoenix Wright. One complaint I had regarding the first Investigations game was that it felt like Edgeworth had begun playing the attorney when that didn't seem totally in line with his character. They actually explore that idea fully here, and given how often Edgeworth hops to the defense's aid in the main series, I think it's an idea worth exploring. When they were first introduced as an organization, I thought the Committee for Prosecutorial Excellence were a contrived plot device established for the sake of boosting the stakes. But as I continued playing, I realized they existed more as a foil for which Edgeworth could test his convictions against. This utilization of all available plot threads is another way in which Prosecutor's Gambit is remarkably well constructed from a storytelling perspective. There are three main things holding back Prosecutor's Gambit from becoming my favorite entry in the series. 1. Case 3 is a bit of a pace killer. Its relevance to the main story is a lot more tangential than the game's other cases. I imagine it was mostly included as an excuse to provide a bit of fan service in the form of playable Gregory Edgeworth, as otherwise its main points probably could have just been summarized during the final case like they did with the SS5 incident. It's not an uninteresting mystery in isolation, but it doesn't service the surrounding cases as much as it probably should. 2, and this one is more of a nitpick, but a common complaint with the Ace Attorney series is that the games will sometimes not allow you to present evidence that in theory should be valid. Largely, I have found this not to be the case, except in this game. This is the only entry in the series where I have personally run into the object versus photo of the object issue. 3, and this is largely a personal issue, but I just don't think the game as a whole quite hits those same highs as my personal favorite entries in the series. It doesn't have the same cathartic finale as Trials and Tribulations, the same carefully constructed mystery element as Spirit of Justice, or Herlock Sholmes. The final case is very good in developing the main cast and tying everything together, but to me it just needed that extra something to push it over the edge.
Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Gates to Infinity was my first exposure to the Pokémon Mystery Dungeon series, and I adored it. Imagine my surprise then when I found out that it was hated online, at least within some corners of the fandom. I've read most of the common complaints about the game. Small deck size, small post-game, the inability to complete more than one mission at once, the lack of a hunger mechanic, etc. But what has always confused me about the hate is that it seems sort of disproportionate to the amount that these flaws actually detract from the gameplay experience. For sure, the game is mechanically regressive, I know it sounds bad, bear with me here, from the previous entries, and I will admit to being a tad biased, but having gone back to this game for the first time in 5 years, these missing features have never amounted to more than minor gripes for me. My two actual complaints with this game, that being the slow text speed and the absolutely incompetent AI, who will often use ineffective moves when they have super effective moves in their arsenal, and start running in the opposite direction if they're more than 2 tiles away from the rest of the party, have nothing to do with the previous entries. Gates to Infinity, when taken on its own merits, gets a ton right in my book. The story and characters are great. Pretty much all of the major side characters have their own character arc alongside you and your partner, and the story has a good handful of fun twists, though I will concede that I'm not a lover of how the final boss was handled. The dungeon crawling is a ton of fun, and of course the soundtrack is excellent. I'm also a fan of how you can customize your Paradise area with various stat-boosting facilities and minigames to earn items. It's just a little touch of personalization that I appreciate. All in all though, come on guys. The quality of life improvements alone are enough to put this over the original Rescue Team games.
Following yet another Pokemon Presents with no Mystery Dungeon news, I finally gave up waiting and decided to just go back and replay Gates and Super instead. Specifically, I wanted to do something in each game that I'd been meaning to do for a while. Recruit Cobalion and Terrakion in Gates, and recruit every Pokemon in Super, which later became getting 100% completion in Super since there wasn't that much left to do after getting every Pokemon anyway, and I thought I just might as well. Though grinding missions to rank up high enough to unlock Cobalion and Terrakion's missions in Gates got a little bit tedious towards the end, I still managed to do it in a cool 30 hours. 100%ing Super, however, was more of an undertaking. I have a great deal of nostalgia for both Gates and Super, but what surprised me most about the two games after replaying them back to back was that while Gates' story held up fairly well, I found myself far less impressed with Super's story upon replay. The plot of Gates to Infinity, though nothing revolutionary, is well constructed, with the subplots revolving around each recurring character tying back into the game's main themes in a way I don't think I fully appreciated when I was younger. Super, on the other hand, is far less consistent. I remember enjoying the school part of the game back when I first played it, but this time around it was hard to see the entire first half of the game as anything but excessively meandering. Up until you and your partner at last take the initiative to leave Serene Village, stuff in this game just kinda happens. It's true that some of these scenes are important for characterizing your partner and Nuzleaf in particular, but otherwise the things that happen during the Serene Village segment of the game don't really contribute much to anything that happens later, apart from the one dungeon that serves as obvious foreshadowing. Then, by the time the plot actually starts, you've already taken on half of the bosses on the start menu, and the game has to fly through its remaining plot beats, not giving them much of a chance to make an impact. Super relies on its numerous plot twists to maintain momentum in its narrative, but these aren't the kind of twists that recontextualized every scene that comes before it, again, except for the one. So, though they land the first time you see them, on replays they don't invoke much of a reaction. Fortunately, though Super's story may not be as impressive as I once found it, it has perhaps the best gameplay in the series. The addition of wands, emeras, and alliances, an evolution of Gates' team attacks, in combination with the fact that every Pokemon up to Hoopa is in the game, allows for a great depth of customization and variation in team building and strategy. To illustrate this point, I'd like to explain how I completed the final mission of this game, the 99th floor dungeon Destiny Tower. Darkrai is the only Pokemon with access to the very potent Dark Void, an AoE sleep move that, in tandem with its ability Bad Dreams, can be used to put an entire room of Pokemon to sleep and then deal chip damage to them. On top of that, Darkrai also has the ability to phase through walls, so it's entirely possible to avoid most fights altogether simply by putting a Pokemon to sleep and then walking around the room's borders. An ideal strategy, as at 99 floors, even if half of your bag is taken up by Reviver Seeds, you're still likely to run out eventually. If that wasn't enough, and you wanted to make this dungeon even easier, you could use Progress Devices, an item that allows you to save mid-dungeon for the first time in the series. Most of the dungeons in the main story are under 20 floors, so these aren't particularly practical during the adventure itself, but they're very useful in the post-game dungeons that are 30 floors and above, as they allow you to essentially create checkpoints. Making them even more useful is the fact that, as I discovered while trying to complete Destiny Tower, Super generates the entire dungeon upon entry, not upon reload, meaning you can memorize the location of the stairs and locate them faster after being defeated and restarting from your progress device. Then, if all that wasn't enough, and you wanted to make this dungeon even easier, you could equip Darkrai with a special treasure looplet, one which I only discovered was in the game after completing this dungeon, unfortunately, that stops your belly from emptying while walking, bypassing the 5 hunger point per tile cost of walking through walls. With all of these factors combined, this 99 floor dungeon can be completely trivialized with a one Pokemon team by walking through walls to find the stairs instead of exploring the old-fashioned way. Unfortunately, even with all of the options that Super's expanded gameplay systems allow for, the basic dungeon crawling loop does in fact start to get repetitive after the nearly 90 hours of gameplay it takes to 100% the game, which is frustrating, because Super is clearly a game designed around 100% completion. Not only does it encourage the player to try and catch them all by showing the number of Pokemon species you've befriended right there on the save screen and the percent of dungeons you've explored on the world map, but by introducing the Connection Orb system as a replacement for the previous RNG-based method of recruitment, it severely cuts down on completion time, such that Super is the fastest game in the series to 100% despite being the most content dense. It's baffling then that they couldn't be bothered to come up with a couple more challenge missions to get the player thinking outside of the box. The only reason I was even able to come up with that Darkrai cheese strat is because, not having fed many of my Pokemon vitamins, I was decently underpowered for the game's final gauntlet. There are only 3 or 4 challenge dungeons in Super, and they're all based around level reset gimmicks. I think there's potential for more mission variety within the Mystery Dungeon formula, and I hope they look into implementing such things in future entries, if we ever get any. If this was my first playthrough of Pokemon Super Mystery Dungeon, I don't know that I would still rate it so highly, something which I can't say about Gates to Infinity, which I replayed earlier this year and still adored. That being said, I'm still glad I finally got around to 100%ing this game after being taunted all those years ago by the marketing, and I do think it's really cool that they included all these Pokemon and gave most of the legendary special missions. I don't think they fully took advantage of all the recurring characters, not really having them talk about what happened in previous entries in any form but the vaguest of references, but it's a small blemish on what is otherwise an incredibly ambitious concept.
You'll have to excuse the odd comparison, but Persona 3 Reload reminds me a lot of Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Rescue Team DX in the sense that as a remake, it doesn't change much, but what it does change does wonders for the game's enjoyability. Persona 3 Portable was an absolute drag to play through, and the only reason I forced myself to finish it was to see how it would stack up against Reload, which I knew would be releasing a few months later. The main thing holding Portable back, as I outlined in my review for that game, was Tartarus. If Tartarus' 250 plus floors of randomly generated dungeon didn't already set you off, then the accompanying boss fights that more often than not preferred to act as HP sponges rather than anything that would encourage the player to take advantage of the game's rather basic elemental weakness mechanics definitely did. Normally I would complain about the way Reload addresses these issues, opting to give each party member a nuke attack and changing the layout style every block instead of properly rebalancing the bosses and crafting a more thoughtfully designed dungeon, but if it works, it works. Tartarus in Reload doesn't make me want to tear my hair out, so I can't complain too much. The other nice thing about not absolutely dreading the gameplay segments is that it frees up my headspace to actually appreciate the writing. The main cast of Persona 3 Reload is absolutely stellar, a fact which didn't fully click with me during my playthrough of Portable. Character writing has consistently been the strongest part of the modern Persona trilogy, to the point where I honestly find it hard to declare a favorite cast out of the three. What sets Persona 3's cast apart from 4 and 5's is how fleshed out they all are as individuals. All their personal struggles are well established, not only through the conflicts that the plot throws at them, but also through their clashes with each other, both past and present. I already talked about this in my review of Portable, but I would be remiss not to once again single out Aigis' character arc as one of the strongest, if not the strongest in the series. Her learning to come to terms with the two initially irreconcilable halves of her identity through her time at Makoto is not only a unique take on the robot with feelings character archetype, at least as far as I'm aware, but also serves to make the game's ending all the more devastating. That all being said, a few of my complaints with the original game do still stand. The game's plot is weirdly backloaded, and the twists are still for the most part poorly foreshadowed. Takaya is largely uncompelling as a villain, spending the first half of the game seemingly baffled at the idea that other people might not want power, and just generally not showing any real human emotion besides mild irritation until the very end of the game. It doesn't help that he looks like Jesus, making him impossible to take seriously. Finally, the rest of the main party being as fleshed out as they are, this is a Persona game where the protagonist being silent works the least. There's still a part of me that wishes Aigis was the main protagonist. It's things like these that still make Persona 3 feel like the scrappy black sheep of the modern Persona trilogy, in spite of the fresh coat of paint that Reload gives it. I hope that returning to Persona 3 for this remake has reminded Atlus of what Persona 3 does uniquely well compared to its successors, so that they might borrow more heavily from it for Persona 6. Finishing Reload, what strikes me the most is how many interesting and unique ideas it has in terms of its story. Persona 4 and 5 lean so much into their characters that as a result, I think their stories become a bit boilerplate. Characters are everything when it comes to storytelling, of course, but Persona 3 is a very character-centric story, so it's not like they would have to throw away all the experience they've gained in terms of character writing over the years to follow in Persona 3's footsteps. As I've said, I think Persona 3 in structure alone is just a bit too rough around the edges to put it above the pinnacle of JRPG polish that is Persona 5 Royal, but a game with Persona 5 Royal's polish and Persona 3 Reload's ambition would be one for the history books indeed. I couldn't fit this anywhere else in the review, but I have to say, I find it incredibly funny that the two best characters in the Persona series are the robot and the dog.
I feel a little disingenuous giving episode Aigis a score this low, as it has some consistently top-notch character writing. Making Aigis the star of the show was the correct move. Frankly, it was something they should have done in the base game, but better late than never. Yukari has some really standout moments, and I will even admit to getting slightly misty-eyed at some moments toward the end there. But that's the thing, all the interesting stuff happens at the end. The entire plot of the game is concentrated in the last 3 hours. Now, you may notice that this game is in fact not a 5-hour adventure, but rather a 15-hour adventure. What are you doing for the remaining 12 or so hours then? The answer, ladies and gentlemen, is Tartarus. Tartarus and only Tartarus. Choosing not to include any new social links in episode Aigis only serves to illustrate how truly barebones and dull the base game of Persona 3 Reload is. It's not that I wanted to tear my hair out playing episode Aigis, but the expansion seems to take a page out of the Persona 3 Portable playbook in the sense that it has no respect for your time whatsoever. The whole expansion reeks of this meeting could have been an email. Ultimately, my problems with episode Aigis epitomize my problems with the Reload project as a whole. I would hesitate to call the devs unambitious, as whether or not you like the direction the remake took, it's undeniable that a lot of love went into making it. That being said, I do think the newbies on staff, who to my understanding were the ones in charge of this project, were too afraid to make any drastic changes to the original. People hail Persona 3 as a masterpiece, but I just can't agree. The pieces are there, but quite frankly they weren't assembled properly. Recently I've begun to grow weary of remakes that try to be a beat-for-beat recreation of their source material. The original games are still there for people to enjoy. Whether or not they're easily accessible is a separate topic of discussion, though in Persona 3's case, Portable is available on modern platforms. And thus remakes, at least in my opinion, should be primarily concerned with either fixing the flaws apparent in the original, or bringing something new to the table. I'm not saying that every remake needs to go in a direction as drastic as Final Fantasy VII Remake, as that can open up its own can of worms, but at least show your players that you as an artist are learning from your mistakes. Whether it be out of respect for the original team or fear of fan backlash, the Reload team chose not to do that. As a 3-hour cutscene movie concluding the events of Persona 3 Reload, episode Aigis is a must, but as an actual bona fide video game, I can't recommend it. It's rare that I tell people to go look up the cutscenes on YouTube, as even with story-heavy games, I truly do believe that having the controller in your hands and interacting with the interactive medium is a different experience than watching someone else play it, but by paying $35 for episode Aigis, you're really just asking to have a solid 10 to 12 hours of your time wasted in order to get to the good stuff. That all having been said, Don't is a banger.
Final Fantasy VII Rebirth isn't a bad game per se. But it is a disappointment in the sense that where Remake miraculously managed to justify stretching out a 5-hour intro sequence into a full 30-hour game, Rebirth left me feeling like they should have just stuck to making one game after all. The amount of padding in Rebirth is absurd. I did all of the side quests in Remake, and initially had planned to do the same in Rebirth alongside all of the Queen's Blood matches, but a couple chapters in I gave up because I was just not having fun. I don't normally hold bad optional content against a game precisely because it is optional, but in Rebirth's case I think it's justified because they're constantly shoving it in your face during the early game. Besides, the annoying padding isn't always optional. When Rebirth isn't being bogged down by its bad side quest, it's slotting extended minigame sections in the middle of otherwise enthralling story sequences. I respect that Rebirth tries to lean into the occasional absurdity of the original game with all of the minigames and whatnot, but when that absurdity actively detracts from the seriousness of the story around it, it just starts to become annoying. None of this is aided by the fact that Rebirth is an Act 2 isolated from its Acts 1 and 3. The story does start to pick up in the back half, but between the stakes only vaguely recalled from the first game and all of the aforementioned padding drawing attention away from what plot is actively happening, the first half of the game often feels like the party is just wandering from place to place without much rhyme or reason save for the fact that it's where all of the hooded men are going. The frustrating thing about all this is that Rebirth has some sequences that are absolutely stellar. Barrett in particular absolutely steals the show in this game, which I really was not expecting. Barrett was a character I always liked, but Rebirth really elevated him with all of his fun comedic moments in the early game and his more serious emotional moments in the back half of the game. Just in general, the story really picks up around the time the party gets to the Golden Saucer. By then it finally starts to feel like the plot has some more direction, and the party starts to feel more active in all of the goings-on what between Barrett's backstory and Cloud and Tifa's shared trauma. I thought the way the game portrayed Cloud's PTSD was really strong, except in Chapter 13, but we'll get to that. And Tifa's trip through the livestream was another standout moment. Rebirth's strengths in adapting and augmenting scenes from the original game makes me think that if they made a single, straightforward remake of the original Final Fantasy VII, it would easily be a perfect time. Unfortunately, much as how the game started weak, it also kind of ended weak, in the sense that the last two chapters kind of lost me. I really don't like how they handled the whole sequence with the Black Material. It was such a memorable part of Cloud's character arc in the original game, because it's a futile moment of him trying and failing to escape from Sephiroth's influence. Here in Rebirth, Sephiroth seems to completely take him over from the moment the party enters the temple, and the whole back and forth with the Black Materia dilutes the strength of Cloud's apparent betrayal. Then immediately after that, at the start of Chapter 14, the game really dives into all of the timeline shenanigans hinted at the end of Remake, and it was all very confusing. First of all, I still don't know how or why Zack is alive, and if he's alive in the main timeline or some side timeline or what, which is odd, because it felt like the end of Remake was setting things up so that Rebirth would answer that question. Then there's the whole situation with Aerith's death. Going in, I thought how Rebirth chose to handle Aerith's death would serve as something of a litmus test for how seriously I should take the Remake trilogy as an earnest attempt to retell the original story going forward. Aerith's death is such a famous and well-remembered moment in gaming to this day, not just because it's sad, but because it ties so strongly into the original game's themes of life and death. If the Remake trilogy has any interest whatsoever in maintaining the integrity of that messaging, they would kill off Aerith. On the other hand, Remake made it clear that the writers didn't give a damn about what the audience thought, and that they were going to do whatever they wanted with this trilogy. So if they really wanted to drive that point home and stick it to the purists, they would let Aerith live. So what did they decide to do? Both, apparently. Even by the time the final cutscene rolls around, it's still not clear what exactly happened. Overall, I just don't understand the point of introducing things like parallel worlds and alternate timelines with Rebirth. At least in Remake it made sense since that game was actively trying to be a meta-commentary on the original, but Rebirth doesn't really take things in that direction. So as it stands, it mostly just feels like the convoluting the plot for no reason. I maintain that Remake is still a great game in spite of Rebirth's relative failure to follow up on that game's formula. So I do have hopes that they can pull things together for the finale, but Rebirth when taken on its own reminds me a lot of Tales of Arise. Its strong middle section is held back by a weak beginning and ending that, when combined with a number of odd gameplay decisions, makes the game an extremely mixed bag. If you wanted an alternate review of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, you could also just watch the ProZD video about games with too many mechanics, and that would get the message across pretty well, I think.
Got this as part of the Intergrade bundle, but decided to wait a little bit after finishing the base game to play it. Well, Rebirth ended up coming out before a little bit rolled around, so I figured I should run through this before jumping into that. It's a fun little expansion. Mostly it's just more of what I liked from the base game, but channeled exclusively through Yuffie, a character that I did not recruit during my playthrough of the original Final Fantasy VII. Yuffie, like the base game's party members, has strong characterization and a really fun playstyle. She mixes melee and ranged attacks in a way that makes for some fun chains, even if it does get a bit mashy at times. I didn't totally see the point in giving a tragic backstory to a character with only 3 hours of screen time, but it led to a strong moment at the very end, so I suppose its inclusion didn't hurt. Nero feels like he walked out of a completely different game, and I was a little iffy on him, but then I saw he was voiced by Reen Schwarzer, which is hilarious, so all is forgiven.
13 Sentinels Aegis Rim deserves a lot of credit for the grace with which it handles its comically dense narrative. The game smartly spreads its million disparate plot threads among 13 concurrent character stories that themselves are broken down into smaller, bite-sized episodes. The character through lines in each route make sure that, even if you don't have a complete understanding of the whole narrative, you'll at least have something to latch onto so that you can get the key points. Then, as revelations from one character route start to feed into loose ends set up in another, you'll be able to piece together the larger plot beats. By nature of the game's intentionally convoluted plotline and the non-linear manner in which said plot is conveyed, the game is chock full of plot twists, of which I am a sucker for. Admittedly, not all of these plot twists land, in the sense that I don't think all of them are quite as cool as the game thinks they are, but when new developments are appearing at a mile a minute, a couple of duds are forgivable on account of their sheer inevitability. I was a little worried about the character writing going in, as developing 13 equally complex and interesting main characters is no easy feat. But with the notable exception of one character whose route appears to be there solely for expository purposes, all the playable characters are at the very least endearing and entertaining. I do question the choice to make the game's most morally complex characters non-playable, but ultimately it's not something that really breaks the experience, so like with the dud plot twists, I don't really hold it against the game. My only actual complaint is that the game really demands 100% of your attention while playing it for all of the reasons I've already listed. That might sound like a stupid complaint, like, of course I want to engage with the media I'm choosing to engage with, but when I play games, I'm usually looking to unwind at least a little, and 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim doesn't really permit that. There were a number of occasions where I wanted to play the game, but I didn't feel like reading for an hour straight to make any significant headway in the story, so I opted to boot up something else instead. In fact, I actually played the first half of the game all the way back in summer of 2023. I put it down mid-July in favor of my Trails Marathon, and didn't get back to it until spring of 2024. I do think that Destruction Mode might have been an attempt on the developer's part to alleviate this issue. You have to play it in tandem with the story mode, so it does functionally break up the plot, and it is pretty mindless on the lower difficulties, which I think was the right call so as to not lock the visual novel portion of the game behind a skill wall. But it's not the main appeal of the game, so if I'm looking for something that's strictly gameplay, I'd rather go elsewhere. The only other game I can think of that feels intimidating in its sheer density is Disco Elysium, which I also played this year and probably should have mentioned in my review for that game, but oh well. Admittedly, I don't think I fully understood the whole story by the end of it all, which does take away some of the luster. I was waiting for some kind of aha moment where it all clicked, but nonetheless, I have a great deal of respect for the uniqueness with which 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim presents itself, and for all the wacky shenanigans that make up its narrative.
Please note that this is not only a review of Animal Crossing New Horizons' Happy Home Paradise DLC, but also a review of New Horizons as a whole following the 2.0 update. Upon seeing the list of features that the 2.0 update added, I decided that I wanted to re-experience the entire game from the beginning to reassess my opinion on it in the aftermath of the various critical New Horizons think pieces that have been produced since the game released in 2020. As such, I opted to restart my island and treat the whole thing as one complete package. Also note that with this review, I am making an exception to my usual review policy. Typically, I prefer to wait until I am fully done with the game to review it, but as of the time of writing, I would still like to finish building all of the co-ops on Harv's Island, fully expand my house, and get a 5-star island rating before I put the game down. The reason I have chosen to jump the gun somewhat is because I don't feel that my thoughts on the game will shift significantly between now and when I finish these things, and also because I have been playing this game for 2.5 months now and would like to include one more review in this video. Having completed the main campaign of the DLC seems like a solid assessment point to me. Strap in, this is going to be a long one. Often, Animal Crossing New Horizons is criticized for being lackluster in comparison to previous Animal Crossing games, and indeed, I intend to engage in some of that criticism myself later on in this review. But going in, I think it's important to note that in a lot of ways, New Horizons is not interested in being like prior entries in the series. Whereas all mainline Animal Crossing games up to this point have been primarily focused on being simulation games with some minor sandbox elements, New Horizons is very firmly a sandbox game with some minor simulation elements. The presentation may appear similar at first glance, but when the game is viewed through this lens, a number of its design choices, such as the reduced amount of villager dialogue, begin to make a great deal more sense. That being the case, if New Horizons ought to be viewed as a sandbox game rather than a simulation game, how does it hold up? Well, in some regards quite well. Features like the Nook Miles system, though the payout itself tends to be negligible after you clear the initial 5 missions the game rolls for each day, do a good job encouraging the player to engage with all of the game's systems, thus maximizing the possibility for creative output. Additionally, the fact that the Happy Home Paradise DLC essentially serves as an endless sandbox mode that also rewards you with new furniture items and eventually bells, though again we'll get back to that later, really reinforces the idea that New Horizons is a sandbox game first and a simulation game second. However, even as a sandbox rather than simulation game, New Horizons has a handful of notable failings. Returning to the aforementioned issue of reduced villager dialogue, though unique dialogue is understandably not necessarily the priority for a sandbox game, it does still ultimately hurt the game to have less rather than more. The issue is not limited to villager dialogue either. New Horizons lacks a lot of the little details and flourishes that made New Leaf such a fun game to come back to even after doing basically everything. For example, compare Toy Day in New Leaf with Toy Day in New Horizons. In New Leaf, you have to spend all month preparing for Toy Day, slowly procuring pieces of the Santa outfit from the Able Sisters and talking to each of your villagers multiple times to find out what gifts they want. The extended structure of this event encourages the player not only to play the game consistently to make sure they have all the pieces of the Santa outfit, but also to talk to the villagers more, increasing their investment in said villagers and thus encouraging them to continue playing the game further after the event is ended. Meanwhile, Toy Day in New Horizons requires no such preparation, allowing you to dole out random gifts to your villagers immediately after giving Jingle 3 pieces of wrapping paper. Though this does force the player to engage with New Horizons' crafting system, the long-term payoff is ultimately weaker, as the event is essentially an over-and-done-with thing. While New Horizons is not trying to be a simulation game, the simulation elements can help to reinforce the sandbox elements. For a smaller example, I was personally disappointed by the lack of a returning barista minigame from New Leaf after the Roost was added in the 2.0 update of New Horizons. Like with the Toy Day event, that minigame made you more invested in your villagers by making you remember what their preferred coffee order was. None of this is to speak of New Horizons' true greatest failing as a sandbox game, though, which is the abysmal pace at which customizations are drip-fed to you. It takes nearly 3 weeks of consistent playing for an hour or two a day to unlock terraforming, which, besides the ability to place furniture items outside, is the main feature that distinguishes New Horizons from previous entries. When the base game is viewed in isolation, this may seem annoying, but not the end of the world. It's the only really egregious example of such a thing happening on your island, after all. Take a look at the Happy Home Paradise DLC, though, and you'll realize how deep this issue runs. Despite being an endless sandbox mode, Happy Home Paradise bizarrely has something of a linear campaign. This choice made sense in Animal Crossing Happy Home Designer, as that game was a standalone title and thus needed something to drive the player to keep going. But New Horizons has the entire rest of the game to incentivize the player to keep playing, so all the linearity accomplishes in this DLC is holding back several major features until later. Features such as partition walls, expanded floor dimensions, second floors, roommates, and, most crucially, the ability to convert Poké into bells are gated off until the second half of the DLC campaign. There's something to be said for not allowing the player access to every option at the start of the game in order to not overwhelm them, but like with terraforming in the base game, there's absolutely no reason to gatekeep the player for as long as the DLC does. New Horizons is often slighted by fans for the issues I discussed 2 paragraphs ago, but those are only minor issues blown out of proportion by how long it takes to get to the meat of New Horizons. Upon replay, I feel adamant that New Horizons never really had an issue with the lack of content. Sure, the number of features missing from previous games prior to the 2.0 update was disappointing, but I still played the initial release for well over 100 hours, so you could hardly say that there was a lack of things to do. Now, I realize that much of this review has read as negative thus far, but in the grand scheme of things, New Horizons is still a really fun game. Even during the period of the game where you are being drip-fed customization options, new additions to the series like crafting and being able to place furniture outside are massive game changers that manage to keep players invested for the, infuriatingly, long period of time that it takes to unlock the remaining features. Additionally, even after unlocking the option to build a second floor in Happy Home Paradise, I still opted to build one-floor houses most of the time because popping in and out to build something quick was just as fun as meticulously planning out a 2-floor mansion for your animal clients. And of course, once you do have all of the customizations available to you, New Horizons really is sandbox heaven. It's hard to overstate how freeing of a feature terraforming is in terms of being able to literally mold your island to your liking. And as stated above, Happy Home Paradise is a blast that only gets blastier with the addition of new features. I can point out technically baffling design decisions until the cows come home, but it doesn't change the fact that I thoroughly enjoyed my revisit to New Horizons. The 2.0 update without the Happy Home Paradise DLC to accompany it isn't as much of a reinvention as I would have liked, especially when looking at how much the Welcome Amiibo update added to New Leaf, but ultimately, I've taken a rather roundabout path back to the opinion on New Horizons that I held when the game first came out. It is good. The think pieces were wrong, in a word, and for that, I am glad.
Balatro is one of those rare games that you will appreciate more over time, as the more you play it, the more you will realize how tightly designed everything is. In my original review, I complained that some boss blinds are objectively more difficult than others, but that's not really true. Rather, certain boss blinds are easier or harder for different builds. You will certainly get RNG checked playing Balatro, but it will be because of your build, not because you've been arbitrarily given a harder boss blind to surpass. Additionally, and this is what I find really impressive about Balatro, you will discover synergies in places you never expected to, as jokers that initially seemed completely useless end up working really well with other jokers. One of my most memorable builds revolved around raising the sale value of my jokers to gain mult. I had Swashbuckler, Gift Card, Egg, and Ornamental Dagger, leaving an extra joker slot open for Ornamental Dagger to continue building mult. Gift Card and Eggs are 2 jokers I would normally never pick up, But when paired with Swashbuckler and Ornamental Dagger, two jokers that feed off of the sale value of other jokers, suddenly they became a great fit. Of course, this was probably not the absolute strongest build I could have made, but it was satisfying to see how these jokers that were largely useless on their own could end up carrying me to victory. Which leads me into my next point on the different stakes. Balatro is a game so cleverly made that there is even value to be found in playing different difficulty levels. The higher stakes will really test your ability to use all the tools at your disposal to create a high-scoring build, and this is satisfying in its own right. But ultimately, said high-scoring builds tend to come in the same flavor. You basically want a ton of melt, so you're always going to pick up certain jokers. On lower stakes, you get to experiment more with different synergies. The different decks will also affect the kind of synergies you can make. For example, on Plasma decks lower stakes, you'll want to build around chip jokers, since it's easier to get chips than mult, and the high chip count will balance out to a high mult count. This kind of chip build would never fly on higher stakes or other decks. My point is that Balatro is such a versatile game, you can approach it from all sorts of angles. It has some of the most satisfying gameplay of any game I've ever played. Also, Balatro works so well as a pick-up-and-play game. It's probably the only game where I'd ever recommend the mobile release over any other platform. Having it portably is seriously a game changer. And yes, I know it has a Switch release too, technically, but that version looks clunkier. Despite only having finished Disco Elysium a year ago, I decided to play it again after my friend finished it and insisted that I had rated it far too low. And yeah, I did. In my original review of the game, I declared that the murder mystery was merely a front for the game's political posturing, but having discussed it more with my aforementioned friend, I realized now that the political posturing itself was merely a means through which the game aimed to dissect Harry's character. Indeed, the game at parts seems to consider politics something of a farce, but that is a much longer discussion for another time. The biggest piece of praise I can offer the game is that every single conversation is important, and all the prose is beautifully written at that. This is a massive achievement coming from the medium from which the slang term NPC was derived. Disco Elysium joins the very short list of games I've played where every single element of it feels intentional and meaningful. There's a part of me that would like to spend the rest of this review rambling about the symbolic significance of Classier, the Pale, the Phasmid, etc., but I think I'll leave that to the video essayists. Bottom line, the game is good. I have to stew on whether or not I consider it a personal favorite of mine, but objectively it's a masterpiece. The only legitimate criticism I can think of, and to be fair, it's a pretty big one, is that the game crashes all the time. Some play sessions it would crash 2 or 3 times. That shouldn't dissuade you from trying the game, though. All it really means is that you should probably play it on PC and not on Switch. Honestly, I'm kind of in awe of Fear and Hunger. It's far from a perfect game, but it's one of those games that was made with real intention, and with those kinds of games, you can feel that intention in every aspect of the game's design. The game does a whole lot with relatively little. I wouldn't describe the game's titular dungeon as particularly large, but there are so many secrets and branching paths that, when combined with the game's treasure trove of lore, make for a world and overall experience that feels expansive. This idea of doing a lot with a little applies to the combat as well. As someone who's messed around with RPG Maker enough times to roughly know how it works, I can confidently say that the limb dismemberment system is an ingenious utilization of the way RPG Maker sets up combat encounters. I, as I'm sure many other fans of this game did, first discovered Fear and Hunger via the Super Eyepatchful video. In that video, he describes Fear and Hunger as an immersive sim. I'm not going to say that this is untrue, but I approached it more like a puzzle game. The dungeon itself is one giant puzzle, and as I died repeatedly throughout my exploration of the dungeon, I began to figure out the exact steps I needed to take in order to solve that puzzle. There's more than one solution to the puzzle, which goes back to what I was saying earlier about all of the game's branching paths, but I never really felt the need to think on my feet. I also didn't find the game to be as absurdly difficult as that video advertised. There were a couple of choke points, sure, but no more than in any other old-school RPG that I've played. Perhaps both of these discrepancies could be explained by the fact that I opted to play on Fear and Hunger mode rather than Terror and Starvation mode, but I've seen other people online say that Fear and Hunger mode is hard too, so maybe it's just a difference in approach. Admittedly, I do wish the game encouraged you to use all of its systems more. There's something to be said about a game that explains nothing to the player and encourages them to discover everything naturally, but you have to have a high level of patience for that, which I simply do not possess. I'm not saying that the game should have obnoxious tutorial pop-ups everywhere, just that it should make the existence of certain systems more obvious by including scenarios where the player is encouraged to use them over other options. I think it says a lot about what Fear and Hunger does well, that it's managed to achieve cult status despite being both unabashedly vile and broken in the same manner as Pokémon Red and Blue, which is to say that it looks fine on the surface, but if you do any amount of poking around, you realize that the game is in fact kind of a mess. Those are two colossal things to ask a player base to put up with, and yet I, like many others, have found myself engrossed by Fear and Hunger. The way the game's pieces all come together make for an experience that has the same magnetic pull as the in-universe dungeon of Fear and Hunger itself.
I played To the Moon several years ago when it was ported to Switch, as I had been tinkering with RPG Maker XP around the time of its announcement, and was interested in checking out some critically acclaimed games made in the engine, though, notably, To the Moon was rebuilt in Unity for the Switch port. I ran through the game in a couple of days and enjoyed it, though I fear I was too young at the time to really understand what it was going for with its plot. I'll have to replay it one of these days. Its sequel, Finding Paradise, landed on my radar when it was announced that that game too would be receiving a Switch port. even if I didn't end up playing it until several years after the Switch port was released and on PC instead. Though Finding Paradise follows the same basic premise as its predecessor, the ways in which it does differentiate itself are what stuck out to me most during the game's first act. A wish as grand as wanting to go to the moon may work as a better narrative hook, but I find the many small regrets scattered throughout Colin's memories to be more relatable. I may not be an old man on his deathbed, but in my experience, the dramatic, life-changing moments that make up most pieces of fiction aren't really accurate to the average human experience. Most of the time, change happens gradually and through a number of small moments, or through decisions you didn't realize were important until after they had already happened. The former tends to work better for storytelling purposes, since your story can only be so long, but I think what Finding Paradise demonstrates is overall more true to life. I was surprised to see that the game had a hearty sense of humor. Even more impressively, it knows how to keep things light while not trampling on the heavier moments when a more solemn tone is called for. True, a good number of the jokes don't land, and occasionally a character will say something that doesn't sound quite right, but they fire off so many little wisecracks that a couple stinkers are excusable. The second and third acts provide a bit more to chew on, the game taking a left turn when it reveals that Faye was actually Colin's imaginary friend instead of a lost lover. Though it initially appeared that this was a way of pivoting away from the idea that Colin was an ordinary guy with ordinary regrets, Faye instead ends up further reinforcing this idea. Even after the two doctors relegate control of the system to Faye, all she uses it for is to talk to Colin one last time, who accepts his regrets as they are. Admittedly, I do think the fact that the doctors allow Faye to, in their own words, play God with Colin's memories, not knowing that she wasn't going to do anything with that power, and the fact that Colin willingly accepted his fate at the end despite seemingly nothing having been done to change his mind about hiring Sigmund, both muddle this message ever so slightly, but I struggle to see what other point the game could be making, so I digress. As one last nitpick, it did seem odd that Dr. Watts' replacement of the machine was neither punished nor explained over the course of the narrative, but they might also just be saving that for the third game, so I'm not too up in arms about it. Other than that, Finding Paradise is a thoughtful little game that was definitely worth the morning it took to check it out.
Earlier this year, I played Space Funeral and struggled to find anything meaningful to say about it, despite enjoying the experience. A general haziness that I largely chalked up to the game's paltry length. Now once again I find myself in a similar situation with how Fish is made. Aesthetically the game is phenomenal, and on paper it poses an interesting philosophical question. Unfortunately, the game's length necessitates that it does not get the proper time to thoroughly explore said question. Whereas a game with more length might be able to dive more into the yes versus no question, here the most the game is able to do is show how seeking the answer has seemingly driven the other fish insane. An interesting conceit, but not one backed up by much of substance. This lack of substance also explains why the game's horror largely falls flat for me. Having a killer aesthetic and tense sound design are all well and good, but if the game can't convince me that those elements are meaningfully building up to something, I'm not going to feel very scared. Though the interactive nature of gaming is the medium's main source of immersion, a large part of that for me is being able to engage with the game's mechanics and the world over an extended period of time. Games give players something to really sink their teeth into. At the same time, it seems reductive to say that games that clock in at under an hour or two simply aren't able to have the same impact as a game that runs for 5 hours, 10 hours, 20 hours, and so on. 10 out of 10 3-minute songs exist, 10 out of 10 episodes of television that clock in at roughly half an hour exist. What is it about short games in particular that causes me to have a hard time engaging with them or otherwise meeting them at their own level? I pose this question rhetorically because honestly, I don't have a good answer for it. I'm more interested in creating a dialogue. I hear A Short Hike is good. Maybe I should check that out. See if it changes my mind.
Ironically, despite quite enjoying Breath of the Wild, it was after completing Zelda's modern opus that I began to feel that the series wasn't really for me. I had always enjoyed the lore and exploration element of the Zelda series, but I had never been a big fan of the dungeon crawling that made up a prominent portion of most entries, and I had started to lose interest in the combat over time too. I found that I could get the things I liked about Zelda without the things I didn't like about them from games in other genres, and as such I drifted away from the franchise. I didn't end up picking up Tears of the Kingdom upon its release, and only ever got around to playing Spirit Tracks because it was a game I had wanted to play back when I enjoyed Zelda more as a series. In spite of all that though, or perhaps precisely because I had taken such a long break from the series, I ended up quite enjoying Spirit Tracks when I finally did pick it up. What most pleasantly surprised me about Spirit Tracks was how much I ended up enjoying the early game dungeons. As opposed to the sprawling multi-floor puzzles that tend to comprise most Zelda dungeons, Spirit Tracks' first couple dungeons prioritize short puzzles that make clever use of the various items Link obtains. The second temple was the highlight of the game in this regard. I'd also be remiss not to mention the main selling point of this game from a fan perspective, that being Zelda's inclusion as a partner character this time around. I do think people overhype her inclusion in this game a little bit, since the plot isn't very interesting and as such Zelda doesn't get very much room to shine as a character, but her presence was still cool as an aesthetic inclusion if nothing else. Unfortunately, I highlight the early game dungeons specifically because the last quarter of Spirit Tracks kind of drags. Aside from the fact that the last couple dungeons veer away from the item-centric puzzles of the early game and lean more towards the sprawling multi-floor puzzles that I'm not as fond of. There is almost no overworld exploration to speak of from the Fire Temple on. The last 5 hours of the game is entirely dungeon crawling, and is in desperate need of some overworld activity to break things up. I didn't even mind that the Tower of Spirits was a dungeon you had to return to, because you don't actually have to replay any section of that dungeon. But I don't think those last 2 visits were particularly necessary. Speaking of which, my other major gripe with this game, this time not limited to the end of the game, is the way the overworld is handled. First of all, the train, though novel in terms of video game traversal methods, moves way too slowly. It would be one thing if there were a lot of landmarks to explore between each major story point, but from what I remember, there wasn't a single optional area on the map. You had to hit every location at one point or another. This was a bit of a shame, considering how the semi-open world with numerous optional islands was one of the coolest parts of Wind Waker. Phantom Hourglass is an aggressively forgettable game, so I can't recall the specifics, but I'm pretty sure even that game had optional areas to explore. All these little annoyances come together to make Spirit Tracks a game that goes on for just a little bit too long. If they trim the fat a bit, it would honestly stand out as one of the better 2D Zeldas. As is, it's still surprisingly good considering the mediocre title it's following up and the bizarre control scheme that they decided to use, but it's still a shame that the game wasn't a tiny bit more polished.
I can't tell if Murder Dog 4 is supposed to be a satire or a satire of a satire or just plain dumb on purpose, and I think there's something beautiful about that.
I do not understand the hype for Zero Escape 9 Hours, 9 Persons, and 9 Doors. Yes, there are like 2 cool plot twists at the end of the game, but that does not make up for the fact that the dialogue throughout the entire rest of the game is just a disaster. First of all 9 of the main characters are total unlikable assholes for the entire duration of the game, with the sole exception of June, who instead of being an asshole decides to be a conspiracy theorist. This entire game is littered with these absurd moments where characters will introduce real pseudoscientific theories completely out of the blue, only for them to turn out to serve as setup for these plot threads that are introduced later. But it doesn't work as foreshadowing because they're introduced totally unnaturally, to the point where it's almost kind of comical how they just come out of nowhere. Characters will just repeat things that happened earlier in the game. They'll repeat things they said 5 minutes ago. Again, circling back to the pseudoscientific theory aspect, the same theories will be repeated over and over again with the entire context, which is completely unnecessary because, again, they come up so frequently you're not going to forget what they are. So, at that point, there's really nothing to keep you invested. I mean, the gameplay's fine, but it's not revolutionary. I've played better puzzle games. The puzzle aspect is really nothing to write home about. And so you just end up with 19 hours of just like these complete jerkasses yelling at each other. And then finally, for the last hour, the game decides, hey, we're going to do some cool stuff with all the math that we've been talking about. And the wildest part of it all is that the game plays this completely straight. It thinks you are totally invested in these extremely unlikable characters. The game thinks you're completely invested in them. And it takes its jank story completely seriously, except for one line at the end where Lotus decides to break character and delivers the line that I think best kind of exemplifies every single problem I have with this game. And so to close out this review, I'd just like to read that line out. What the hell? What the hell? What are you talking about? It's 9 years this and 9 years that, and when it's not 9 years something, then you're talking about some sort of fucking experiments. What in God's name are you talking about? You aren't making any sense. That is a real line from this game. A real line. And it just baffles me that they're so serious about it, and then, like, self-awareness dawns upon them for 5 seconds and elevates the most annoying character in the game to the best character in the game. And it's just, if this is the best game in the series, I am so morbidly curious as to what the other entries are like. I feel at least a little bit bad for enjoying Papers, Please. Immigration, at least from my understanding, is nowhere near a fun process, and in nearly every other aspect of that game, that idea is captured well. From the drab color palette to the minimalist sound design, the game has an incredibly heavy atmosphere. But I can't help it. Cross-referencing increasing quantities of paperwork as your main gameplay mechanics should be tedious, but once you get a feel for how it works, you realize that there's a certain rhythm to it, and it actually becomes fun. Sort of on that note, but largely unrelated, I was hoping for more emphasis to be put on the actual people whose passports you're reviewing. There were a couple of exceptions. The characters related to the token side quests were all great, especially Yorji, who I was consistently rooting for to get his paperwork in order. But largely the game is lacking the sort of interpersonal moral dilemmas that its premise would otherwise indicate. In choosing to tackle broader strokes themes, it loses out on the potential to tell more emotionally compelling stories, which is what I think holds it back from being an all-timer for me in terms of narrative-driven indie games. Also, maybe this is a little petty, but I'm not sure why they bothered with including 20 different endings when there are really only 3.5 endings, and the rest are glorified fail states. It gives the impression that the player's choices are more impactful than they actually are.
What I appreciate the most about Slay the Princess is how responsive the game is to your choices. Even if some paths ultimately do lead to the same chapters, and even if the number of options you as the player are given are relatively limited, that doesn't change how impressive it is that the game will react differently to each and every one of them, whether that be on the micro or macro level. The game gets really creative with some of its routes, and the more oddball choices are rewarded with appropriately oddball outcomes. On a more moment-to-moment basis, the dialogue is consistently witty, and the hand-drawn frames are yet another instance of a unique art style in an indie game that really helps the game to stand out and build atmosphere. My main issue with the game is in regards to its ending, though less so because of anything specific and more due to a handful of smaller factors. First off, despite running through all of the different routes you've seen in that playthrough, the ending as a whole is pretty short and, well, ends abruptly. The game as a whole feels like it just falls short of landing on a really strong thematic conclusion. Its overarching narrative of two gods and a forbidden love is a unique one, and sounds cool on paper, but not all of the routes are actually about that, so depending on which ones you take, that messaging could potentially come completely out of nowhere. The ending also touches on the duality of life and death and how one can't exist without the other, but doesn't really go further than that. I can't rate Space Funeral too highly because it's so non-substantial from a gameplay perspective, but it's free and an hour long, so you don't really lose anything by playing it. I love the vibes both in terms of the aesthetic and the soundtrack, and the dialogue uses the same rhythms that Shigesato Itoi does in the Mother series, which is always a plus.
Okay, technically I completed this next one October 1st, but you're just gonna have to give me a pass on this one because I played the bulk of it in September and I didn't want this just to be a 3-minute video about Prosecutor's Gambit. Anyway, fan teams are sort of insane, aren't they? They spent nearly a decade developing a full-length video game, putting in the work to make it as close as possible to the original, both in terms of style and scale, and then just drop it online one day, completely for free. Honestly, if I were Toby Fox, I'd pull a Sonic Mania and license the Undertale IP to the Undertale Yellow team so they can be compensated for their work while he still gets a cut of the profits. Heck, based on Undertale Yellow's sheer quality, I'd commission them to make prequel games for the 5 remaining Souls as well. As far as I'm concerned, Undertale Yellow is all but officially canon. To speak in more specific terms though, where Deltarune works remarkably well as a spiritual successor to Undertale, taking Undertale's core stylistic components while completely reimagining its gameplay systems, Undertale Yellow is exactly what I would expect to see in a more direct follow-up to Undertale. Though the game follows the same visual aesthetic, the sprite work is more detailed, and there are several instances of more fluid animation than are found in Undertale proper. On top of that, Undertale Yellow cleverly remixes the underground, taking us through altered versions of the Ruins, Snowdin, and Hotland, while quietly replacing the least interesting section of the original game, Waterfall, with a much more entertaining locale in the form of the Dunes. Undertale Yellow also greatly expands on Undertale's bullet hell combat system, with more elaborate patterns that both better reflect the different monsters they're attached to and vary more in terms of design. That is, how they move and what you have to do to dodge them. If I may be so bold, I would even go as far as to say that I prefer the plot of Yellow to that of the original Undertale. Now, to be fair, Yellow's narrative could not function without the original game's narrative to use as a base, but as any good prequel does, Yellow utilizes Undertale's premise to set up a more character-oriented narrative heavily entrenched in the original lore. Obviously, Yellow's characters come nowhere close to matching the iconic status of characters like Sans and Papyrus, but they still have a charm of their own. And though I was only lukewarm on Martlet, I really enjoyed what Starlo and Soroba brought to the table, both in terms of personality and narrative stakes. Of course, Undertale Yellow isn't perfect. For all my praises of the narrative, both the beginning and the ending of the True Pacifist run fall a bit flat for me. Going back to what I said earlier about Yellow remixing the underground, it kind of felt like the writers didn't know what to do until Clover got to the new area. The Ruins and Snowdin were included out of a sense of obligation, but apart from the player meeting Martlet, nothing much of note actually happens in either location, leaving the plot relatively stagnant from the game's opening to roughly the 2-hour mark. As for the ending, bittersweet though it may be, Clover's sacrifice kind of felt like it came out of nowhere. Going into the final boss fight, it seemed so obvious to me that the game was going to end with Soroba and Clover coming to a truce before Flowey swooped in to kill Clover for not finishing the job. But that's not what happened. I'm not saying that the game was wrong for subverting my expectations, but when you do it without much setup, the whole thing ends up being a bit jarring.
Clover certainly has more of a personality than Frisk, but not enough to the point where I thought they would make a move as grand as sacrificing themselves. Additionally, for all the gameplay does to effectively build on Undertale's base, I have to say, the last 2 major boss fights were kind of bullshit. A lot of fast, hectic patterns that were not only difficult to react to on first brush, but difficult to really learn and time dodges to properly without the near abuse of healing items. Also, my game crashed when it tried to roll credits and I had to look them up online.
Who's Lila scratched that exact itch I had for a neat little indie mystery/horror game with its bizarre yet intriguing narrative and ARG elements that strike the perfect balance between making the player go out of their way to see everything and not being too convoluted to follow. 2 complaints. 1, the point-and-click controls are not nearly responsive enough to carry 2 entire stealth sections. And 2, the game's main mechanic, that being the face-stretching feature, isn't as integral to the plot as the game's marketing would lead you to believe. The feature is totally superfluous to most of the more lore-intensive endings, which is a shame, because I think it's a really cool idea that could carry an entire game's worth of content, with or without the ARG stuff that I liked. Just food for thought.
And that's all the reviews I have for today. I'll probably have another set of reviews propped up for the end of the year, and until then, I hope you enjoy everything that I release in between.